Today's video is sponsored by Raycon. So if you're a longtime fan of mine, you guys know that I'm a bit of a metalhead. So during my workouts, I need a quality pair of headphones to handle this absolute brutality that you see on screen now. Raycon was co-founded by American singer and songwriter Ray J, and has been endorsed by celebrities like Melissa Etheridge, J.R. Smith, Mike Tyson, and Rich the Kid. And the company has been a huge supporter of independent creators like myself. So when they reached out to me, I was interested to try out their earbuds. I first heard about them through Leon Lush and the absolutely hilarious promos that the internet historian does, and by pure coincidence my old pair died on me, so the timing for this was perfect. Raycon sent me a pair of E25s, and I wasted no time trying them out. The first thing I noticed was that they were extremely comfortable. When I sort of zone out during my workouts, I couldn't even feel them in my ear, unlike my last pair that got uncomfortable after a while. The earbuds they sent me are blue, but they do come in a variety of different colors, with no annoying dangling wires or stems. They have seamless Bluetooth pairing with around 6 hours of playtime. With their competitive prices, you can grab a pair of Raycons for half the price of other premium brands. And no joke, I've tried these headphones out for myself, and I wouldn't be doing this ad if I didn't like them. And if you aren't satisfied with your headphones for any reason, Raycon has a 45-day free return policy, so there's absolutely no risk. Please support my channel by clicking the link in the description, or by going to buyraycon.com/unit522 to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. I would like to remain anonymous. Many of you are not going to believe this experience of mine, and I accept that. But this is something that has haunted me for nearly 30 years. No matter how many times I keep telling myself that I was just a kid, and there's nothing I could have done, it doesn't seem to help at all. This took place in the early 90s, in my small New England hometown. I grew up there with my best friend Jacob. Our town was near the Canadian border, in one of the most remote regions of the United States. We lived there because my father worked for a factory that was located in Canada. I don't think most kids today could survive in that kind of environment. Well, let's just say that if you weren't into the outdoors, you would be bored out of your mind up there. Fortunately, Jacob and I were your typical outdoorsmen. Weekends were spent sledding, hiking, fishing, and canoeing. Whenever my family wanted to go do something together, we usually took weekend trips down to Burlington, or we'd go visit my grandparents in New Hampshire. One day, me and Jake were hiking through a forest that was located next to our neighborhood. It was early fall, so there was a light drizzle of snow on the ground, which was nothing compared to the amount of snow we got during the winter months. Since Jake and I were very young, we would often allow our imaginations to run wild when we were out there. We had to make our way through an area where some trees had fallen into each other, which created this sort of natural sanctuary that resembled a cave, which we called the Devil's Throat. Past the fallen trees was a small lake, which we nicknamed the Lake of the Dead. Beyond that was a maze of thick, towering pine trees, the Forest of Lost Souls. It amuses me that I can still remember all of these landmarks. It was like we created our own little world out there. On this particular day, we dared to venture further than we ever had before. The Forest of Lost Souls was a cutoff point for us, as we didn't know our way around past that point. Jake brought some neon green tree markers with him, and suggested that we find out what was beyond the pine trees. We both were adamant that if we found another lake, we would name it the Lake of Life. When we reached the pine trees, Jake began to tie the green markers to the trees every 10 yards or so, always making sure that each subsequent marker was within sight of the last. We made it about 50 yards into the Forest of Lost Souls when we came upon something that I can only describe as a crater in the earth. I'll try my best to give a good description. The tree suddenly stopped at a slope that dropped off. At the bottom of this depression, was what appeared to be the entrance to a small cave. Upon seeing this, me and Jake got super excited. We had found something better than a second lake. Since the sun was beginning its descent, we decided that we would explore this cave another time, but first, we had to give it a name. We decided on Skeleton Cave. I remembered staring at the mouth of the cave and getting this cold feeling in my stomach. Even though I couldn't see anything, it was as if something in the cave was staring back at me. Several days later, we followed the tree markings back to the cave's entrance. This time, we brought flashlights with us. We carefully made our way down the slope and stopped at the cave's entrance briefly to make sure the flashlights were working properly. We then entered the dark mouth of the cave. Upon entry, that cold feeling enveloped me once more, but Jake was too excited to be feeling any sense of unease. We came across some interesting rock formations as we made our way further inside, until we eventually reached a dead end. I couldn't really tell you how deep this cave was, but we went on for about 15 minutes before we could go on no further. Jake and I were talking about what we should name the rock formations, when suddenly, Jake caught his foot on something. We both shined our flashlights to Jake's left foot and were met with something that was beyond reason. I had to take a break writing this because I started second-guessing myself. Should I really put this out there? I don't know if anyone hearing my story will get anything out of this, other than entertainment. After taking several shots of whiskey, I came to the conclusion that I should just go for it. Anyways, back to the story. So Jake caught his foot on something and we both shined our flashlights to see what it was. There was what appeared to be a snake coiled around Jake's ankle. At least, it looked like a snake, but it seemed to have hair. Jake screamed as he was pulled backward into the dark. I stood there petrified, with the flashlight by my side, listening to the screams of Jake. I'm gonna have to take another shot of whiskey before continuing. My 11-year-old self was paralyzed by absolute fear. However, I did raise my flashlight to see what was in front of me. Jake was dangling upside down in midair, flailing his arms about wildly. My flashlight beam was partially obscured by Jake's hanging body, but I did catch the glimpse of a pair of angry, glowing eyes. Jake was lifted further into the air before he was slammed onto his face. I just stood there, witnessing the horrifying occurrence play out. Jake was still alive and was making this awful gurgling sound. As he lifted his head, I saw his broken face before he let out a muffled scream as the dark mass lifted him into the air again. That's when I dropped my flashlight and took off. I could still hear Jake screaming, "Help me!" I ran all the way back to my parents' house and immediately told my dad about what happened. Both Jake's parents and the police were called, and a search party was put together. While that was taking place, Mom sat by my side as I explained to the police officer what happened. Now, I did tell the police officer the truth in a general sense. We went into the cave, and something grabbed him, and I ran out of the cave and left him behind. I withheld the snake-like thing I saw wrapped around his ankle, and the dark figure with angry eyes. After about an hour, the remains of Jake were found. I didn't find out until many years later. His body was mangled almost beyond recognition. I don't remember much after that. I was sent to stay with my grandparents for a couple of weeks, until the situation blew over. I would eventually go back to my parents, and we moved out of my hometown, closer to the city. I've never seen or heard from Jake's family ever again. There were several follow-up interviews with the police, and they even brought in a child psychologist to get the full story out of me. I can't really remember that whole process too well, but my mother ended up going to court to put a stop to the interrogations. With the investigation hitting a dead end, Jake's death was never officially determined. I think the police suspected that I killed Jake, but had no evidence to support that theory, so they were fishing for some kind of confession. And that's when things got ugly. I also think this is the real reason we left that town. I've put this whole thing behind me for the most part. To this day, I still have reoccurring nightmares. In the dream, I'm running through Skeleton Cave, listening to the screams of Jake behind me. I would always have this overwhelming urge to turn around. But every time I do, I wake up, screaming. Before I begin, I wanted to say that ever since this has happened to me, I've had panic attacks every time I've gone outside for more than 15 minutes. This has really taken its toll on my social life and health. All the times that my parents have tried to get me to go outside, I always come up with an excuse not to. Also, I'm going to skip most of the graphic details of the story. Because of this story will be a bit short. Now let's get into it. This story takes place when I was 6. My mother briefly left me alone in a park while she went into a nearby store to grab a drink for me. The only reason that she left me alone was because our 5-year-old Doberman was with us. We'll call him Buster. Buster is very protective of me and barks every time anyone gets too close. This would scare most 6-year-olds, but for me, I felt like I could take on anyone and anything when he was by my side. When I was sitting down, Buster and I heard a noise from behind us. Naturally, we both turned around to see what it was. There was a small fox in the distance, and just as I was going to turn back around, it got sucked into the forest. We then heard a noise, and I listened carefully. It sounded like a pack of rabid dogs were chewing on meat. Most kids my age probably would have passed out in fear, but I was like a deer caught in the headlights, and Buster was going crazy. About a minute later, I saw something moving where the fox had disappeared. If my mom hadn't attached Buster's leash to the bench, he would have taken off. Here in England, most people don't believe in a creature called the Skinwalker, but I strongly believe in them after what I saw. A figure then emerged from the trees. It had to have been about 7 feet tall. It was so skinny that you could see its ribcage under a thin layer of skin. In that moment, I threw up all over the bench and started crying, as more of what looked like the same creature emerged from the shadows. Soon there was about 8 to 10 of them approaching us. When they were about 10 to 20 feet from us, Buster found the strength to break his leash and charged after them. At the time, I was devastated that my dog was going to die. But as soon as he charged, they scattered like a herd of sheep. Just as Buster came back, my mom walked through the gate, and the rest is a blur. When I asked my mom about this just before writing down this experience, she told me that when she found me, I was as pale as a ghost, and when she asked me why Buster had broken off his leash, I barely managed to relay what happened. She took me home and called the police, and told them about what I said. They said that they would look into it and would call with any follow-up details. At about noon, we got a call saying that they found the remains of a mutilated fox. They also found some bones that matched the description of what I saw. My mom called the station to see if they had any more details on the case. They said that there have been 20 similar incidences reported since my experience in 2009. Back in 85 or 86, my dad was released from the army and was going through some tough times from some fucked up things he had to do during his time in the service. After he came back, he would drink himself into a drunken stupor, mumbling something about a school bus. I remember him saying, "They were only children." I don't know what he was talking about, but he definitely had some skeletons in his closet. His troubles didn't end there, though. One night he was camping somewhere on the border of Alabama and Georgia in the Appalachian woods. It was late at night and he was in his tent. He had his fire pit set up and had plenty of gear with him. Camouflage clothing, some night vision goggles he stole from the army, and a hunting rifle. After he dozed off, he suddenly woke up, alarmed. He instinctively grabbed his rifle and aimed it at the tent's entrance. It was still sealed up by the zipper, and everything was still. However, he could sense that he was in danger. He focused and listened carefully. After about a minute, he heard the rustling of footsteps outside. Whatever was walking around out there was near the fire pit. He was fairly sure that it was some kind of animal sticking its nose where it didn't belong, but he listened more intently and realized the footsteps were distinctly human, or so he thought. He could see the glow of the dying fire and the shadow of a dark silhouette through his tent. He could feel himself sober up as adrenaline began to sharpen his senses. He then heard something. Breathing. It didn't sound human. It sounded like a beast was outside his tent. He then continued to watch the figure through the tent and noticed that the figure seemed almost human-like. The figure turned towards the tent. He then leveled his gun and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was drowned out by an inhuman, blood-curdling scream as the figure scampered off. My dad put on his pair of night vision goggles as he unzipped the tent and scanned the area with his gun. He then noticed that something was about 20 or 30 feet away from him. It turned and stared straight at him with glowing eyes. He swears up and down that it was some kind of deformed, fucked up looking creature. To this day, I can still see the fear in his eyes whenever he talks about it. He fired off another shot in its direction, but the bullet missed as the creature ran further into the dense forest. My dad retreated back into his tent and taped a flashlight to his rifle. He pointed it at the tent's opening until the sun came up. In the light of the day, he started investigating the area and found evidence of the strange creature from the night before. There were these misshapen footprints in the dirt, much larger than a wolf. He also observed droplets of dark red blood on the ground. He packed up and decided to leave right away, not wanting to take any chances with whatever was out there with him. He honestly believes that he had an encounter with some kind of werewolf, or possibly some sort of shape-shifting thing, like a Skinwalker.